Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. I rise in support of the bill that's in front of us, and I suspect everybody will be supporting the legislation. The Shadow Attorney-General, the member for Isaacs, made some points about the request from the opposition as to why there should be a 12-month review. And I want to refer to those, and in doing so I'm in no way indicating that anybody should oppose the legislation before us. But there are good reasons why there ought to be a 12-month review, and it's something that we are asking the government to consider, because we want to deal with it in the House and for it not to come back here after the Senate. The appropriate way for it to happen would simply be for the government to bring in a government amendment on a 12-month review, which is a simple piece of drafting and quite possible to be turned around quickly. There are good reasons for it. It's very rare for us to deal with legislation of this sort of urgency. The last time I can remember having to have an emergency shadow cabinet meeting and the emergency meetings that have had to take place only having just received drafts of legislation was back in 2005. In 2005, there was an amendment made to anti-terrorism law that was brought forward by the Howard government because there were people planning an actual attack on sites in Sydney. There was a real threat. The legislation went through that day, through both houses, and arrests took place a few days later. It's a very, very unusual thing to be doing what we're doing today. And with that in mind, when it is that unusual, all the normal processes of inquiry aren't able to happen, understandably. A review period allows the parliament to still do its job. Because I think a lot of the speeches that we're hearing from each side do make clear that what we're doing today, to some extent, we are using a piece of legislation to send a message that is far more substantive than to change the law. Yep. That's what's happening in the parliament today. We're using legislation to send a message, and no one wants to stand in the way of that message. No one wants to stand in the way of that message, and to oppose the legislation would create the worst of all messages, and no one's going to do that. But it is worth thinking through why there ought to be a review. Mm-hmm. Certainly what we have in front of us, while incredibly serious, is certainly different to the emergency legislation we dealt with on terrorism under the Howard government, with all the advice of the agencies that came through at that time. I don't know what the implications are, other than for this particular issue, of redefining our legislative definition of public infrastructure to include a strawberry. But that's in front of us right now. No, the supply chain issue's there. If you look at the amendment, it deals both with the facilities and the food itself. It deals with both. And that interjection shows that not every member of parliament is across the legislation that's in front of us. And that's not a reason to vote against it. But it is a reason, if we have members who are here in the chamber listening to the debate and giving interjections that are contrary to the legislation that's in front of them, that's a precise reason why we need to make sure that we have a 12-month review. We are also opening up a change in sentencing, which is the most significant part of sending a message. Often when we change maximum sentencing periods in the parliament, it's off the back of a view that judges have not been bringing down sentences which we believed were consistent with the intention of the parliament, where we think sentences have been too short, too brief, and therefore we have said, no, we'll increase the maximum, and that will send the message to the legal system. That's not what we're doing today, because there are no recorded convictions. So it can't be the case that we think the sentences to date have been too soft, because without convictions there have been no sentences under the current legislation. So we're increasing a maximum to make that public statement, and no one wants to get in the way of that public statement. But it does mean the maximum sentence that we are adopting today is more than the maximum sentence in some jurisdictions for statutory rape, more than the sentence for human trafficking, more than the sentence for strangulation in a domestic violence circumstance. Now, working through the implications of that is something we all have to do. We have two jobs in this place. We are members of parliament leading a public debate, and we are also legislators. And today, we have decided the importance of leading that public debate is so important that we will take some shortcuts, and we're all in this, we're all making the same decision, me too. We will take some shortcuts on what we would ordinarily do in terms of due diligence on legislation. That's a decision we've made. Now, in the face of that, we shouldn't in the same breath say we will never be legislators on this particular issue. The right thing to do is to say we will send the message today loudly and clearly. We will make it clear the level of offence that is there for people who've performed these acts, and we will make clear the level of support that is there for Australia's strawberry growers. That's the right decision today. But at some point, unless we have a review clause in, we will never do the other part of our job as legislators. We do need to work through what are the implications, and there might not be any, but we need to have at some point the full context of what are the long-term implications of a very significant redefinition of public infrastructure. We do need to work through what is the impact of changing the relativities on different sentencing, and do we believe that we've now got those relativities right, given where it stands next to other crimes that we would all believe are among the most heinous that could be committed. So what the Labor Party, what the opposition is asking of the government today, and we're saying we're not going to play the game of moving an amendment and insisting on it or having the House have to hang around in case we can get it through the Senate. We're simply saying we want everybody here to do all of their jobs. We're all doing the job properly today of leading a public debate, and no one should pretend there's not bipartisan support on that, and cross-party support there is. But we are not applying the normal due diligence we would to a piece of legislation, and a review period will make sure that we fulfil that responsibility as well.